Hi everyone, good day. This is 𝗪𝗧𝗏, producer of Japan Wind Energy 2021. Welcome to WindAPAC Digital Webinar, produced by Leader Associates as a new educational online platform for wind power industry. And it is well known that the Japan Offshore Wind Promotion Act came into force in April 2019, and round one auctions in 4 sites are in progress now under this act. And Japan's version for offshore wind power also includes the target newly formulated in December 2020 in collaboration with the government and the private sector, with a target of 10 GW by 2030. And the cost target is about 8 to 9 yen per kilowatt-hour by 2030 to 2035. And inward investment to build a reliable supply chain and a long-term plan to strengthen the power grid. Technology roadmap, including floating, are also the key issues right now. Facing such a rapid growth, we are very honored to have Baker McKenzie as our knowledge supporter to enable this webinar to draw a clearer picture to you what is going on from 4 different perspectives by Mr. Ian, Mr. Nick, Mr. Pierre, and Mr. Masa. And here is the brief agenda of today's webinar. Every presenter's presentation will be around 20 minutes. And after all speakers finishes their speeches, there will be the Q&A section open for every audience. If you have any question, please kindly raise your question in the Q&A box on the bottom of your control panel. And last, about the presentation slides, we will send you the slides by next Monday. Many thanks for the knowledge contribution for Baker McKenzie again. And now let's start with our first presentation of today. Mr. Ian talking about the introduction to Japan's offshore wind laws and partnering with Japanese companies. Mr. Ian is co-head of the project group and renewable and clean energy group in firm's Tokyo office. His practice focuses on the commercial and the renewable energy power projects, resources acquisitions, joint ventures, major projects, and corporate work. With the recent growth in offshore wind in Japan, Ian has advised a number of leading global offshore wind developers on their entry into the Japanese market. And Mr. Ian, please kindly share your screen and begin your presentation.
All right, thank you, 𝗪𝗧𝗏. Just bear with me. How's that look? Is that working?
Yes, it's worked well.
All right, well, thank you very much, 𝗪𝗧𝗏, and we're very happy to be here today presenting on Japan's offshore wind sector. Just as a quick introduction, I've been based in our Tokyo office now for 20 years, and most of that time I've been working in renewable energy for renewable energy projects inside Japan and outside Japan for both foreign and Japanese companies. And really since 2012, when we had the FIT scheme introduced in Japan, our office has been extremely busy on renewable energy projects. And in a way, we're quite lucky because we're an international law firm, but we're also the largest, I think, international law firm in Tokyo. And uniquely, we have more Japanese lawyers than foreign lawyers. So we're able to handle inbound renewable energy investment very well. And we've been very, very busy since 2012 in particular on renewable energy project work in Japan. So with that background, I'm going to talk a little bit on the background to Japan's offshore wind laws, and also to touch on the, here we go, partnering with Japanese companies, which is a big topic in the market at the moment. So just to start with, one of the big questions we've had from a lot of foreign clients as they come to Japan and look at the market is, why hasn't offshore wind development occurred in Japan up to now? You know, it's been a real source of puzzlement for people to understand why it is that we haven't seen offshore wind take off yet in Japan in the way it has in Europe and in Taiwan in the region. And for us as lawyers, you know, we do look to the legal regime, and I think that you see in countries that have succeeded in developing an offshore wind sector, the government support and clear laws and regulations are really one of the big keys. So the big problem Japan has had really is that there have been no national level laws that cover Japan's general sea areas. So if you've wanted to do an offshore wind project in Japan's seas, you haven't had a clear set of laws that will give you the rights to use that offshore wind area. What we did have was we had prefectural rules. So Japan, has the national government, and then it has prefectural level governments. And so 38 of Japan's prefectures, which is most of the prefectures that have a coastal area, did have their own rules. But these rules weren't set up for offshore wind projects. They were really to allow all sorts of other things to happen in the sea area. And when the client said to us, well, why can't we just use those laws or those rules? And we've explained to them that typically these rules are one paragraph long. And what they really say is, if you'd like to do something in the sea area, please come and talk to the prefecture. So they're not things that give a lot of certainty. The fact that they weren't national level laws didn't give them a lot of strength. And the period that these laws or rules granted was also very short, 5 years. So that just meant for the cost and scale of an offshore wind project, it wasn't going to be bankable. It wasn't going to give you the certainty you needed to develop the projects. In 2016, we had the amendment of the Ports and Harbours Act, and that act applies to areas that have been designated as ports and harbours in Japan. And there are quite a few of those areas, but only a small proportion of Japan's sea area is covered by those rules. So those 2016 changes began the process of really opening up Japan's sea area for offshore wind development, but it's only been more recently in 2019 when the offshore wind law came into effect that we've seen the sort of huge increase in interest and activity in the sector. Having said that, the Japanese government has tried very hard to promote this area, and we've had a series of pilot projects, and there's a picture of one there, focusing really on floating offshore wind. I think it's clear the Japanese government realised that floating offshore wind is going to be one of the keys to unlocking this sector in Japan, given the nature of Japan's seas and the sea depth. So the government itself had sort of promoted these floating test units. Near shore, and when I say near shore, it was almost on the shore, 65 megawatts were developed. And those ports and harbours projects that I talked about, we've had a few come up. Akita Noshiro is sort of underway now. Kitakyushu was one of the first. These are going to be sort of the trail breakers, if you like, for the projects in the general sea area. So what does the new offshore wind law do? Well, it sets out rules for using Japan's general waters, the areas outside the ports and harbours. It sets up a two-step process, under which the local prefectures and interested parties can sort of work to have an area designated as a promotion zone. And after that happens, then there'll be an auction process to award occupancy rights to use that sea area. And linked with that will be the FIT scheme rights, the right to sell the electricity to the utility in that area for the price that you offer in the auction. The rights that you will get will extend for a maximum of 30 years. And that takes into account a sort of 20-year PPA period under the FIT scheme and the construction and decommissioning periods. And obviously, if you can operate the project past that 20-year PPA period, the hope perhaps is that there'll be projects feeding their electricity into the market even after the PPA has ended. We'll talk a bit more about the FIT, but it is a reverse auction process. And the reverse auction bidders compete to offer a lower price, but they also have to compete with their qualifications and experience in this area. So that's a really critical aspect of the Japanese scheme, and we'll dig into that, because that does help explain why so many foreign companies are coming in and teaming up with Japanese companies to gain those all-important auction points. So with that as background, and Nick will talk more detail on the auction system, and particularly the lessons from the previous, so the recent auctions that we've had underway, and what the rules look like based on those. But to talk a bit about partnering with Japanese companies, why it's happening, where the value is for both sides, and I think that's something that everybody is looking at now to form the best consortiums they can for the auction processes. So just as a sort of background, I think it's worth foreign companies in particular understanding that it's only very recently that we've had a lot of foreign investment into Japan's power sector. if you go back to 1995, which is when the wholesale electricity market opened, there were some entrants into the market, and Enron was a high-profile company that sort of had big plans to operate in Japan. But there wasn't really a lot of foreign participation. It was only in 2012, when we had the FIT scheme begin, that we really had a rush of foreign developers coming into Japan to participate in that scheme. Some of them have done extremely well. Some of them found it challenging. I think all of them were surprised at the differences in Japan. The cost structures in Japan in particular are much higher in a lot of ways than other countries. So there was a lot to learn, and there has been all sorts of knowledge gained by the foreign companies and the Japanese companies through that period of the FIT scheme. 2016, we saw the opening of the electricity retail market, and we had a rush of foreign electricity companies, particularly US companies, coming in to join the liberalised electricity retail market. It's somewhat separate to the investment in the FIT scheme, but again, it was sort of, if you like, a second wave of foreign investment into the electricity market. And then since 2019, with the offshore wind opening up, that's where we're seeing this new rush, this third wave, if you like, of foreign companies coming into the sector. But what all that means really for foreign companies is, the Japanese companies are not accustomed to joint venturing in a way with foreign players inside Japan. It happens a lot outside Japan, obviously, with Japanese investment into Southeast Asia, for example. There's a lot of joint ventures down there. But certainly on the FIT scheme side from 2012, we didn't see a lot of foreign companies joining with Japanese companies to develop projects. The foreign companies really had to go it alone. I think it's fair to say that the Japanese companies didn't see a lot of value in teaming up with foreign companies to build these sort of smaller sized solar projects. So that's a big difference now, and I think it's clear, and hopefully we can touch on that in the next few slides. There is a new dynamic, and that is that each side recognises that teaming up, putting foreign and Japanese companies in a consortium together will give you, maybe help maximise the chances of securing the occupancy rights in the offshore wind auctions. So just to sort of touch on some of those aspects, why would you want to partner with a Japanese company? Well, the auction rules look at both the price, but also critically, your operational experience, your experience in developing offshore wind projects, both in Japan and in foreign countries. So there's a certain number of points that get allocated for that experience, and everyone's looking to maximise the points they can gain based on their experience. Foreign companies coming to Japan, the language and cultural barrier issue is a real one. And, I think many foreign companies have had to work very hard to learn how to do things in Japan, and it's not like other countries. It's possible, and we've seen companies do very well in this area, but it is something that is a challenge that foreign companies face. And part of that is the challenge of recruitment. And Japan doesn't have a very fluid labour market. It can be challenging for foreign companies to really hire top-notch Japanese management. So teaming up with Japanese partners can help you overcome that hurdle to a certain extent. The local stakeholder engagement, drilling down to the prefectural level, dealing with fisheries groups. I think foreign offshore wind developers have got a lot of experience in this area from other countries from Europe, but it needs to be done in a culturally appropriate and obviously in a very Japanese way. It's not beyond belief that a foreign company could do this, but I think that the process is probably going to work better if you are teaming up with a Japanese company that has that experience. And the last one is the bankability of projects and putting together a consortium that has some very strong Japanese players with deep financial balance sheets and foreign companies with very strong experience. So with all that in mind, and hopefully those slides have already brought this through a bit, but the Japanese government's objectives in creating the offshore wind scheme are obviously to drive down electricity prices, and they're very aware, I think, that Europe has done a great job in this area of really achieving some amazing efficiencies and getting project costs down. And we now have a situation in Europe where, the electricity cost of electricity generated by offshore wind projects is extremely low. And so the Japanese government thinks that's very attractive and would love to have that occur in Japan as well. But they also want to have an offshore wind sector that grows very stably. The FIT scheme in 2012 was successful, but the nature of the scheme meant that there was no barriers to entry. So one of the problems Japan faced was a lot of people flooded in. There was a lot of speculative activity at the time. And the rules for the offshore wind auctions are really designed to stop that. There's no chance of someone going in, bidding a low price, grabbing the auction rights and then selling them off to someone else. The whole system is now designed to stop that. It's designed to bring in very strong players, to have them stay for pretty much the life of the project, to contribute their experience into constructing and operating these projects. So if you don't have that experience, if you're just looking to come in and perhaps participate in the auctions and get these rights and sell them off to someone else, that's not really going to be possible. The system is set up to make sure that it's the very strong players that come in and get these auction rights. So we'll look at the sort of the auction points in the next slide, but what will come through, I think, is that it is creating these barriers to stop the inexperienced players coming in. The government wants to see the parties that win the auctions being the ones that are able to construct the projects successfully. Their experience in procurement and contracting and operating these projects is something that the points get allocated based on that experience. And it's really all about getting those parties to build the projects and operate them throughout the PPA period. So this is the auction point system, and Nick's really going to jump into this. But half the points are based on price. So 120 points out of the 240 points come from the price you offer, and the lower the price is, the more points you'll gain in that part of the auction. So that's possibly an easier task than the qualifications, although for the price you will need to, bidders are going to have to do a lot of work to get on top of the EPC costs, the contractors that are able to deliver these projects and the pricing from those contractors. But also on their side, each of the consortium members is going to have to demonstrate that they themselves have these qualifications. And if you look on the far, I don't have if you can see my cursor, here on the far left side, the track record. And there was some feedback about this in some of the METI Q&A, and there's been a small change here to the extremely appropriate track record category. And these, you can see that the points that are allocated ranking. So, you might have a good track record, then it'll get you 9 points, but an extremely appropriate track record gets 30 points. So everyone's trying to demonstrate that they have got this extremely appropriate track record. Previously, that was only in Japan, but I think the question that came up was, obviously there hasn't been a lot of projects in Japan. Can bidders use their experience outside Japan? And the response has been yes, if you can show that that experience is adaptable to Japan. So, your ability to demonstrate that your knowledge from an offshore wind project outside Japan, can be adapted to be used in Japan, can take account of local conditions and local stakeholder concerns, the different sea conditions in Japan, the different seabed conditions, for example. So that experience there will form a large part of the track record. The realisation of business. What this is talking about is how well can you develop this project? How well can you, build the project and operate it? So showing your experience in that area, and also the plan that you have and how you will, carry out the project once you achieve you obtain the occupancy rights. Yeah. And the stability of your power supply. Again, the operational stability of the project. Then moving across, you can see that the local stakeholder engagement is is very important. And that is something we think that the Japanese companies perhaps have a bit of an advantage over foreign companies. But by joining together, foreign and Japanese companies will hopefully be able to cover that off. And then finally, the knock-on effect is really talking about contributions to the local economy. And it's important to note, Japan doesn't have the sort of local content rules that we've seen in Taiwan. Although demonstrating that in your plan will give you a big advantage. So Nick will talk a bit more on that. Just to sort of cap off, we've been very busy helping foreign companies and Japanese companies join up. And I guess just some observations, some things we've learnt over the sort of past 2 years as that's been taking place. The first is sort of highlighting the foreign party's value. Because I think the market is, in this learning curve, the attractiveness of a foreign party is evident if it has had experience in offshore wind development, but really digging down into that on a very granular level, and perhaps thinking about how you can demonstrate in the auction bid how that foreign party will bring its value, and that might be in procurement and supply chain. May not be in stakeholder relationships, although obviously that's something that the foreign party can help with. But I think probably more focusing on foreign parties' experience in putting projects together and creating a very attractive financial proposition for the bid. A lot of the foreign companies we've been talking to ask us to do due diligence on projects. I mean, the fact is there's not a lot to look at yet. In some cases, and Masa, my colleague, will be talking about grid connection rights, that some of the Japanese developers have gone out there and tried to and have secured grid connection rights for the auction. So that's something we've been looking at where they exist. But typically there's not a lot to look at yet in due diligence. The contract language comes up as a big issue. English or Japanese, each side would like their own language. There's reasons to do both, but it's an important discussion that we like to have at the very beginning in our foreign clients to identify that with the Japanese companies they're talking to, which language will be in the contract. The management team. So, I think one of the lessons we've seen, those foreign companies that invest find those really top level Japanese team members to head up their local operations and to engage with their joint venture partners are the ones that are succeeding. Putting a lot of effort into this side of it. I think the higher the quality of the Japanese management, the quicker and the better you'll sort of achieve results in Japan. Obviously, tax structuring, there's a lot of wealth of knowledge. Our office has a very good tax team. The accounting firms are right on top of this. There's a lot of thought being put into that side of it and how that can feed into the bid economics as well. Funding, that's a big issue when particularly bigger foreign companies are talking to smaller sized Japanese companies. How do we handle the funding and the costs of these projects we've seen are huge. So an important discussion to be having with the JV partner. The consortium is looking to bring in new participants, and that's something that we've seen being discussed from the very beginning. Not just the initial 2 consortium members, perhaps, but an idea that will continue to bring new participants in as the bid gets closer to the auction process starting, to increase the attractiveness of the consortium. And lockups being a part of that. We want the original companies to stay in there. So that's just some points we've come across, and we'd be very happy to talk to you in more detail if anyone would like to contact us. And with that, Starry, I'll try and hand back to you. If you're able to take it off me, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for the excellent presentation. And now we will quickly move to our next speaker, Mr. Nick, to do the deep dive into the auction rules, including updates on the recent METI, MLIT responses, and the Port Lease Agreement. And Mr. Nick is partner of the banking and finance group and the co-head of the firm's renewable and clean energy group in Tokyo. Nick is currently advising 2 projects of port offshore wind power and 2 projects of round 1 offshore wind power in Japan in a total more than 1 gigawatt. And Nick has been advising more than 300 megawatt onshore wind 3 GW solar power, 500 megawatt biomass. And Nick is a leader of JWPA Offshore Wind Finance Task Force since 2019. Nick has significant experience presenting Japanese and foreign international financial institutions and sponsors. And Mr. Nick, would you please open your camera and turn on your voices to begin your presentation to the audience? Hi, Ms. Nick. Yes, it is your stage right now.
Yeah, thank you, Stanley. Hi, everybody. Very good afternoon. I'm Nick Eguchi, partner of Baker McKenzie Tokyo. I'm going to speak about the auction points. Screen.
Yeah.
Oh,
that is the slideshow and the first one. Yeah, right.
Did it change?
So far, no. And yeah. Sorry, we haven't it on the full screen. And would you mind we share the slides from our side? And
Sure. Yeah, I'll ask you to page down.
Okay, sure. Please allow me some minutes.
Sure. So let me talk. Today is a very good day in Japan. Very fine weather, and the Olympic, the torch running started yesterday in Japan, and the COVID situation is under control. And thanks to METI, MLIT effort, the round one auction is on schedule. It's progressing. Thank you, Stanley. So can you move on to second page? Yeah, the next page. So today is a deep dive into auction rule and including update of the recent METI and MLIT Q&A responses, which was issued 1st of March, and also a Port Lease Agreement. So next page, please. So this is a current round one auction. Goto Island floating one was already closed. So the bidders all submitted their proposal last December. And now the two Akita Noshiro and Akita Yrihonjo North and Akita Yrihonjo South and Chiba Choshi, the remaining round one auctions to be closed the next this May. So the people are preparing their bids at the moment. Actually, I'm helping the sponsors on round one auctions at the moment. And since this is a round one, a lot of issues came up, and we need to resolve one by one. But thanks to our Q&A session, we got several responses from the METI and MLIT. Actually, these type of Q&A session is very important to make sure the transparent and international standard auction should be taken place. For example, as Ian mentioned, in a GOTO auction process, only a Japanese capability point will be evaluated for the top runner column. But many people questioned on this point. So thanks to METI and MLIT reconsideration, in Akita and Chiba cases, auction rule, the overseas capability could be taken into account for the top runner evaluation. That is a good improvement. But still, we will see issues. So we need to communicate with METI and MLIT and ask them to improve the situation one by one. So let me touch on these issues from now. Next page, please. This is an auction chart which Ian mentioned. So this is a part of the overseas experiences taken into account, the left side and top side corner. Next page, please. This is a detailed evaluation criteria. So you need to check the right-hand side column and make sure you can present your capability, your plan in concrete manner. There may be some interview session at the last after the submission of your proposal. At the time of the presentation, it's not easy to overstate what you are presenting, because the evaluator is a specialist for offshore wind sector. So that's why they can easily identify some contradiction within your plan. So it is very important to make sure to prepare your proposal consistent throughout from page 1 to the last. Actually, I served the evaluator of the airport privatization in Fukuoka airport. It was consisted by 7 members. I took part of the legal side and the finance side evaluation, but each evaluator will point all aspects of the criteria. And in the presentation stage, we interviewed several bidders, and we heard the presentation, and we made a question. And some of the university professors made a very teasing question, and the bidders had a difficulty to explain their proposal because they had some mistake in calculation. So it is very important before submitting your proposal, you should check your proposal many times to make sure not to have any inconsistency among your proposal. Next page, please. And this is also, again, it's a corporation side of the local economy. This is also very important to make sure present that you are cooperating with the local economy. Some of the Japanese people thinks offshore wind is a big project, and the big companies in Tokyo or Central Europe or the overseas came in and took all the capital out of local people and go back. That is an image of the local people. So it's very important to make sure that you are partnering with the local people and you are investing in the long term and make sure you will be a party to a local society. So this is very important aspect in your proposal. Of course, in Europe and in Taiwan, the experienced players knows how to make a good local contribution proposal. So that's that is very important point for you to make sure in Japanese proposals as well. Next slide, please. And this is the very brief description of the bottom fixed offshore wind auction conditions. It's clear in the auction guideline already. So I won't repeat because the time is limited today. It's a 20 years feed-in tariff and a 30-year occupation period. And you may have a chance to extend over 30 years, but the criteria for the extension is still vague. So it's not easy to count on the extension period. But clearly, if your power wind farm is still operating and it's beneficial to the local people, there may be some chance to extend. The grid issue will be touched by the MASA. In the last bullet point is the decommission. Basically, the full 100% decommission is in principle. But as you can imagine, in a bottom fixed or the 4-leg or 3-legs structure, it will be a serious cost. So some maybe the METI and MLIT will allow you to cut the monopile, the 1 meter below the seabed, that puts the remainder in the ground of the seabed. This may be subject to Ministry of Environment authorization. So the bidders can choose this route in your bid proposal. Next page, please. And the second part is a local fund issue. In a Goto city floating case and also Akita case, local fund will be established. And the local council indicated the 0.5% of the FIT revenue for 20 years is a kind of indication. Of course, each bidder can propose, and after the winning the bid, the winning bidder will be a party to the local council, and they will decide the actual structure of the local fund. I will touch on this issue after the latter part of my presentation. So the ฤihonjo city mentioned, this local fund should be used for the total compensation to the fishermen. And the individual fishermen's compensation should not be asked. But it's not a clear rule yet, so we will see how this local fund will operate in future. Next page, please. This is the bid bond structure, and it is divided into the first bid bond and the second bid bond and the third bid bond. And the third bid bond is relatively high, but thanks to Q&A session, in a Goto case, it was 12 months. But in Akita Choshi cases, it's extended to 24 months after the selection. So during this 2-year period, the winning bidder can check the seabed conditions and the construction schedule and make sure final investment decision is feasible or not. So you have a 2 years window for this purpose. Next page, please. This was the Q&A responses released on the 27th of November. This was the first Q&A session. And there are several issues identified. The one issue is the COD period. COD period is a very fixed period, which is proposed by each bidder. Why METI is so strict to this COD period was a bad experience of the solar cases. 2012, the solar power project feed-in tariff started in Japan, and there was no COD period at first. So some of the players delay the construction and gets the higher, keeps a high FIT price and enjoy the lower construction price after 5, 3, 6 years time. So that was a mistake by METI. So that's why METI is very rigid on the COD period. This is an issue. What is the exemption for the severe COD period? That is a point to be further discussed. Next slide, please. This is a new Q&A points released just 1st of March this month. And there are several points mentioned here. The big one is 241 to 248. This is the point on the local fund. Many people asked what kind of local fund structure is designed, but unfortunately, those points listed here are not responded by METI, and those points will be discussed after the award, and after the award, the winning bidder will be a member of the local council and decide these detailed points in that local council. And 249 point is a bit the cautious point. This is the Akita Noshiro or Mine Oga only, but according to the local fishery association, they couldn't tell which area is difficult to agree on a wind turbine installation. So this may be a kind of a risk after the award. The winning bidder may be asked to change the layout they are originally think about. Next slide, please. And this is Akita Port Lease Agreement, which was just released in last December. So there are several issues in Port Lease auction, Port Lease Agreement. This is because the port lease rent structure is designed for MLIT to recover all investment they make to accept the heavy structure, heavy facilities structure in a port. They are reinforcing the ground condition to endure the heavy substance. So that additional investment cost will be recouped by the lessees. At the moment, Akita will be used by a 𝗪𝗶𝗍 consortium who are now constructing Akita Port offshore wind. So the winning bidder of 𝘬𝘰𝘠𝗀 auction, if they use the Akita port, they may share the port use with 𝗪𝗶𝗍, and the rent is shared by the capacity basis. The calculation is made by the capacity basis. So next slide, please. The actual calculation is described based on 730 megawatt versus 135 megawatt 𝗪𝗶𝗍 case. So 40 billion will be reduced to 3.375 billion because it is shared with 𝗪𝗶𝗍 projects. So this is a port or lease agreement, and the bidders should take into account those type of the investment recovery rent structure. Next slide, please. And the port lease agreement built in the decommission bond and the performance bond as described here. So the bidder should take into account this additional bid in addition to auction bid is count into your proposal. Next slide, please. And this is a Baker McKenzie advertisement. We are member of the WBC Sustainable Development, and we are a front runner of the Sustainable Development project. So we are happy to help your offshore wind projects in Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Ms. Nick. Yes, which is really of the guidance meaning and the rules and the local regulations is always what the audience care about. And now we can see there is one question in the Q&A box, but we will go through the questions after all our 4 speakers' presentation. And all audience are welcome to have interaction with our audience. So please kindly raise your questions in the Q&A box and we will go through it later. And next, let's welcome Mr. Pierre to share his insights into the financing anticipated variance in Japan from European or Taiwanese financing. And Ms. Pierre is a member of the firm's banking and finance group in Tokyo, and has 15 years of legal experience working in Japan and overseas. Pierre practices in the area of banking and financing, focusing on renewable energy project finance. Since the inception of the Japanese renewable energy feed-in tariff regime in 2012, Pierre has represented investors and lenders on solar energy projects representing over 1,000 megawatt of generation capacity, and has been advertising on offshore wind projects since the implementation of the offshore wind promotion law in 2019. And Ms. Pierre, please kindly share your screen and begin your presentation.
Well, thank you, Story. I'm just doing that now. 1 moment. Just start the slideshow. Okay. All right. I believe you're probably seeing the start of the slideshow. So thanks again for that introduction. I will be speaking today.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Pia. Would you please click the button on the display setting and choose the second one to make it on the presenter mode?
I see. One moment.
Yeah, the second one on the display settings.
Yeah, no, I just need to actually access it because the Zoom screen is on top of it.
Sure.
Sorry, one moment.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, one moment. There, is that better?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Apologies for that. As noted today, I'll be speaking about some anticipated variances in the financing of projects in Japan from what market participants might be more familiar with in Europe or Taiwan. A couple of words of cautionary words, if you will. One, I'm using European in a somewhat loose context here. Obviously, there is a significant amount of market experience in the UK as well as in the EU. I'm including both of those in the term European here, so hope that doesn't offend anyone. The other point is that here we're talking about a financing market in Japan which has very little track record in relation to offshore wind at the moment. These points that we're talking about today are anticipated variances. What you actually see in terms of practice could well differ. Okay, so diving right in, I'm a little bit conscious of time here. I wanted to talk about the single most important agreement really from a financing perspective is the primary source of income, the power purchase agreement or the PPA. Now, the form of the PPA that's used in Japan is different from what market participants in Europe or in Taiwan may be familiar with. The PPA in Japan has gone through a few different iterations. It was originally left to the utilities to come up with their own power purchase agreements. Then METI came out with a standard form of power purchase agreement that each of the utilities essentially adopted. And that was a bilateral contract that was usually executed. And that practice has since evolved. And what the utilities currently have is that they maintain a series of general terms and conditions for the PPAs on each of their websites. Now, those general terms and conditions are essentially the same as what had been previously covered under the METI form of PPA, but the structure of the contract is somewhat different now. If you look at the three sort of steps on the right, these are, at least from a theoretical legal perspective, the three steps to contract formation for the PPA. The power producer will apply to the utility for the PPA. The utility will then accept that application, and that essentially constitutes contract formation. So the PPA would at that point be effective. And then there will be an issuance of a notice, in Japanese it's called the 𝗬𝗪𝗓𝗄. It's essentially a confirmation of the terms of the PPA that gets sent by the utility to the power producer. Now, the reality is that these last 2 points are often conflated because from the power producer's perspective, you're not going to know whether or not the utilities actually accepted your application until they send you the notice indicating that they have done so. And historically, the utilities have often held back on sending that notice until you get fairly close to COD. The reason for that is not that the utilities have any hesitancy about entering into the PPA. There's no real expectation that they won't enter the PPA. In fact, they have a legal requirement to do so. But realistically, during the course of construction, there's quite possibly slips in project schedules. So the anticipated date of COD, the start of commercial operations may move from time to time. And rather than issuing one notice and then having to go through the same process to issue a new notice with a different date on it, is something that the utilities have historically tried to avoid. There may be some changes in terms of that practice for offshore wind for a couple of different reasons that I will go into shortly, but that's the current practice for PPAs. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that with general terms and conditions being published by the utility, those general terms and conditions can be changed unilaterally by the utility. Now, that is not exactly a situation which many power producers or lenders are entirely comfortable with, but the reality is that to the extent that the utilities actually do change those terms and conditions, there's quite an involved process in doing so, and those changes are generally expected to conform to changes that are required in relation to any amendments that happen to the Renewable Energy Act. Those changes must not be contrary to the actual purpose of the PPA and must be reasonable. So the real risk is significantly less than the theoretical risk, but at the same time, the one constant factor is that the terms of the PPA can, at least in theory, be changed unilaterally by the utility. So for a couple of different reasons, including some requests by lenders, some of the utilities in Japan will, upon request, execute a bilateral contract instead of issuing that the notice. That's the third sort of bubble on the right. Not all utilities do that. The practice isn't uniform. And even if they do, the bilateral contract that's executed is still subject to unilateral change by the utility. There's provisions in it that essentially give the utility the right to change the terms if there's, for example, a corresponding change to the Renewable Energy Act or some other reason why that change is required. So regardless of whether the standard sort of practice of concluding the PPA in Japan is followed, or if a bilateral document is actually executed, the fact remains that the terms will still remain subject to unilateral change by the utility. Now, that is essentially sort of a change of law risk mostly, but that change of law risk is generally accepted and has been accepted for years by financial institutions in the Japanese market. Financial institutions that don't have a great deal of experience in Japan will likely find this somewhat uncomfortable. But the reality is that the form of the PPA is not likely to change simply because of the fact that some of the financial institutions that aren't familiar with the practice in Japan aren't comfortable with it. So that risk will remain outstanding. The next point is kind of also relating to the PPA, but also just to project finance practice in Japan generally, and that's the use of direct agreements. Now, in the UK, Europe, and Europe particularly, there are usually long-form direct agreements that are entered into the various contractors and, more importantly, the off-taker. Now, direct agreements, generally speaking, exist to provide the lenders with an ability to step in when they enforce the security. So they want to be able to step into the shoes of the borrower if there's a problem either under the actual document that's subject to security or there's a problem elsewhere in the financing. They want to make sure that those important contracts to the project will remain in place, notwithstanding the actual enforcement of security and potentially a replacement of the borrower. However, in Japan, there essentially is no practice of using these kinds of direct agreements. There are a couple of different ways in which similar issues are addressed in Japan. One of which is when you give a pledge or some other form of contractual security in Japan, that the form of the consent to that security will often include certain undertakings on the part of that third-party obligor. There may be limited notice periods that will require that party to notify the lenders if there's an issue. You may also get standstill period or extended grace periods, somewhat similar to the way that you would in a European-style direct agreement. And the manner in which the lenders can step in is often also addressed in the consents to security. If it's a pledge, for example, that could include an acknowledgement or an undertaking by the third party not to take instructions from the borrower after they've received an enforcement notice, and then to only take instructions from the agent. Similarly, any amounts that need to be remitted can be diverted effectively by the agent to an account specified by the agent, and the third party will undertake to respect those instructions. So that's one way in which Japanese practice addresses a similar issue. In addition, there's a form of security. It's not listed here in the points, but one of the forms of security that are taken, it's not specifically security, is an option agreement for a transfer of contractual position. Now, those documents aren't signed by the third party. They're signed between the borrower and the finance parties, and they may be consented to by the third party. But essentially what they allow for is the novation of those contracts to an entity that's meant to replace the borrower. There's some debate as to how useful they are in practice, but that type of documentation exists in Japan. And taken together, they have similar effects to direct agreements, but it's a very different style of practice, and some of the undertakings are somewhat more limited. An important point, though, is that the utilities, generally speaking, have historically not agreed to give even the relatively limited undertakings that we're talking about that are found in these consents to security. So it's possible that these protections, at least in relation to the PPA, might not be available to lenders. But, and this is a point that I think will come up a little bit more when the documentation becomes a bit more well developed with the particularly with the off-taker, with the utilities, because it's likely that this practice is going to be tested, and that, you know, as more and more of the financings for these offshore wind projects come in, direct agreements in some form may become part of the Japanese market practice. They might not, but it's a possibility anyway. There have been similar issues, for example, in Taiwan is a good example, where Taiwan also didn't have a market practice of any kind of a direct agreement. But because the lenders were essentially really quite displeased with that when it came to the off-taker, there was some pretty intense lobbying, and eventually Taipower agreed to some bespoke step-in rights in favor of the lenders. So it's quite possible that we could see sort of a similar process in Japan, but it's unclear at this point exactly whether or not the utilities will agree to give that kind of flexibility. Okay, this has been touched on somewhat by Nick and by Ian, actually, in relation to some of the restrictions that apply under the public auction guidelines. Now, one of the points that was raised is in relation to changes of control. Specifically, as Ian mentioned, the rules that are in place right now have been formed on the back of some experience by METI and MLIT wanting to make sure that, you know, the sponsors and the participants that are involved in these projects are going to be there for effectively will bring the right levels of skills, the right levels of creditworthiness and trustworthiness, and be there probably for the long haul. As a result, the transfers of voting rights under the public auction guidelines require a change to the occupancy plan, and any changes to the occupancy plan are then subject to the consent of METI and MLIT. So what that means is that transfers of voting rights are then subject to the consent of METI and MLIT. Now, the factors that are considered by METI and MLIT will vary on a case-to-case basis, But generally speaking, there are two sort of overriding considerations. And one is whether or not the transfer promotes the public interest. And two, whether or not the transfer is, for some reason, unavoidable. If there's somebody's encountered financial difficulties, or there's another very specific reason to replace a party, then they'll take that into consideration. Now, on the face of it, those two criteria would seem to be pretty hard to satisfy in terms of just a simple commercial transfer. But the public auction guidelines actually do state, and METI and MLIT have acknowledged, that the liquidity of capital itself is something that promotes a reduction of finance costs, and hence is tied to a reduction in overall energy costs. So the liquidity of capital itself is seen as something that promotes the public interest. Now, as a result, unless you hit some particular triggers, generally speaking, your transfers that don't hit those triggers are expected to be approved and will be considered to be something that promote the public interest. Now, there are, however, certain transfers that trigger a more careful review by METI and MLIT. I've got sort of, they're down here, basically they're involving changing the enterprise that was evaluated in the bid that has the largest amount of voting rights, or the withdrawal entirely of an enterprise with voting rights that was evaluated for bidding purposes. And then there are certain sort of numerical thresholds that apply before COD at having to maintain at least 2/3 ownership, or voting rights, pardon me. And then after COD, having to maintain essentially at least half, more than half of the voting rights. So not allowing a change of control away from the consortia or the shareholder at the time of the bid. These are obviously geared toward ensuring that the entities that were contemplated at the time the bid was submitted are entities that can still be relied on. So those are the reasons essentially for the transfers that hit those triggers to be evaluated much more carefully by METI and MLIT. Now, an important point to note about this is that this is separate to any change of control restrictions you might have under your financing. The financing conditions and the change of control levels that might appear in your financing will be, I think, more commercially developed between the parties themselves. Now, any change of control will obviously need to satisfy the public auction guideline requirements and obtain the consent of METI and MLIT, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the change of control restrictions on your financing will be exactly the same as the ones that apply under the public auction guidelines. I'm going to switch a little bit to some more general sort of cash flow related issues that relate to these projects in Japan that may be a bit different. The COD deadline question, this has been touched on by Nick, particularly when he was talking about the reason that METI and MLIT are being very sticky about the having a committed COD date. Under the public auction guidelines, what happens is that the bidders are required to specify a date for COD that they undertake to achieve. And that's essentially the deadline they need to meet. Now, that deadline has to fall within a certain period of the bid award. Overall, it comes out to 9. There's a different breakdown. It works out to a total of 9.5 years of the bid award, 9.5 years of the bid award. But the breakdown essentially is that after the bid award, there's an application for FIT certification that has to be received within a year. And then there's a 6-month period for the FIT certification. And then once the FIT approval is obtained, the COD has to be within 8 years of that. So it's a total of 9.5 years. But the reality is, for most bidders in the round one auctions, is that if their COD, if their scheduled COD, will need to be significantly earlier than that in order to maintain, to get a decent evaluation for the points for it. So there's going to be some risk that the risk will exist anyway, but there'll be more risk that is driven essentially commercially by wanting to get the best points on the bid. And in order to get the best points on the bid, the COD deadline that you suggest should be, as close as possible to what you think you can achieve. Now, the consequences are is that if you fail to actually achieve COD by that deadline, then the fit period will be shortened for the period of delay. Now, exactly how the shortening happens hasn't been entirely confirmed. It may be day to day or maybe month to month, but essentially the period of delay will shorten the period during which you can enjoy the feed-in tariff. A couple of other elements, and these are somewhat related, that differ or will differ in practice here from what might be the case in Europe or other jurisdictions, the UK, is pre-completion revenues. Pre-completion revenues, I mean, generally speaking, it's just the revenues that you receive selling to the market before you commence receiving your feed-in tariff. For compliance with the Renewable Energy Act, however, METI has indicated that, from a practical perspective, pre-completion revenues will not be available. And the reason being that under the Renewable Energy Act, once you start selling power, whether it's under the FIT or at market price, your FIT period commences. So if you tried to obtain pre-completion revenues, you would essentially be starting the 20-year period, even though you might not be able to obtain your feed-in tariff. So there's no value in doing so unless you're already going to be past your COD deadline. So this creates cash flow issues necessarily, as the entire plant may not all become operational at the same time. So there's continued lobbying on this from various sponsors and other stakeholders to try to get METI to move on this. There's been no change in their position in the Q&A so far. But there is, I think, continued hope that METI will eventually come around and change their position on this to amend the Renewable Energy Act accordingly. A second point, which is somewhat related, is in relation to deferral rights. Now, deferral rights are a mechanism of financings that have been a feature in some of the UK and Taiwan financings for offshore wind. Now, what it is essentially if your project is slightly delayed in terms of getting to COD and you have you're starting to hit your principal repayment dates for a limited set, usually 1 or 2 repayment dates, you are able to essentially defer those payments and spread them out across the remaining tenor of the facilities. There are often very strict conditions as to what you can do when you can do this and why you can do it. But it is a mechanism which has been a feature in financings, but is unlikely to feature, at least early on, in transactions in Japan, because it's not been market practice in Japan. To the extent any deferral rights have been accepted in project finance in Japan to date, they mostly consist of essentially shifting the entire repayment schedule in order to ensure that the same repayment profile occurs. But those are very uncommon as well. So we're not really expecting that to be a common feature in most of the early financings for offshore wind in Japan. Similarly, wind normalization. Wind normalization, if you're not familiar with it, is a feature, a mechanism basically that allows a project to cure historical DSCR defaults because of the fact that, for whatever reason, you simply didn't get as good or as much wind during a particular period as would ordinarily be expected for the area. It's a mechanism that's been adopted recently in the UK, but it is still new. It's not universally adopted in the UK. And the expectation is that, particularly given the novelty of offshore financing, offshore wind financing in Japan, is that it's also not going to be available for at least the early transactions in Japan. If it turns out that eventually you come to a scenario where there is some significant variability for wind over a period of time, it's possible that this might come in as a feature for Japanese offshore wind financing, but at least at initial stages, it's unlikely to be available. A third, next is the decommissioning reserves. I think Nick has spoken to these in fair detail, so I'm not sure I'm going to add a great deal of this to that. But one of the points that I might mention is that the public auction guidelines requires or requests all bidders to assume decommissioning reserve requirements equal to 70% of the total marine construction cost. Now that doesn't include turbines, but it obviously will come to a fairly large number. Now that the actual amount of the decommissioning reserve after a bid award will also depend on what is actually agreed is required in terms of decommissioning. That's something that is not yet quite fixed. So it's possible that the amounts that are actually required to be reserved for decommissioning may change after the round of auctions. But at the moment, the assumptions are that they're required to be 70% of the total marine construction cost. Another factor which comes up is this generation side wheeling charge. Now, for people maybe unfamiliar with the practice in Japan, this hasn't come in yet, but it's expected to come in. And it's meant to effectively have power producers pay for essentially part of the grid costs. Now, it's expected to be implemented from the 1st of April 2023. The actual amount of the levy is still being discussed, but recently the committee on this working on this at METI has confirmed that for renewable energy sources, the generation side wheeling charge is going to be levied on the basis of not just the kilowatt rating of the facility, but also the kilowatt hour output of the facility in equal measure. So the wheeling charge would be assessed 50% on just what your kilowatt rating is, and then the other sort of half of the assessment would be based on what the kilowatt output of the facility is. Now, this is a bit of a concession to renewable energy in a way, in the sense that renewable energy sources tend to have a comparatively less efficient kilowatt output than other sources that can be on 24/7. So the expectation is that the generation side wheeling charge levied on renewable sources will be somewhat lower than it would be on other sources of power. However, for a lot of projects, this is not going to be also relevant for, particularly relevant for most offshore wind projects because they won't have been in place beforehand. But a lot of the existing FIT projects have already paid certain amounts for grid improvements, and whether or not there's an adjustment to that has yet to be determined. Finally, just a couple of points which will relate, I think, generally speaking, to not only the financing, but also the project documents as well. Considerations of governing law and jurisdiction and language. Now, for governing law and jurisdiction, for the financing, the standard position both in the UK and from Taiwan was to have English law related, English law governed documentation. That is clearly not the standard in Japan. There is no standard yet for offshore wind, but we would expect that Japanese lenders would prefer Japanese law, although most of the large Japanese lenders are usually capable of working with English law. There are obviously consequences as to that choice, particularly if you're going to be selecting English law as the governing law. You might get better input, better take up, essentially on syndication from lenders that are already active in the UK, European, and Taiwanese offshore wind space. But the flip side of that is that domestic syndication may be more challenging because domestic financial institutions, more regional and non-bank financing sources are not as comfortable with English law. So there's going to be a bit of a balancing act in terms of the selection of governing law. Obviously, the governing law of the security documents will differ depending on the security interest, so that's not expected to be a barrier. Language, however, as was noted by Ian as well, is a real barrier from time to time. I mean, even if the governments even if the documents are meant to be governed by Japanese law, many of the project documents, particularly if you're dealing with contractors from offshore, will struggle with Japanese language documents, and many of the lenders may also struggle with Japanese language documentation. as such, I think the expectation, or our expectation anyway, is that many of the early financings will probably be using English language, documentation, other than maybe with respect to some of the security documents. Not simply because of the fact that some of the lenders are going to be more comfortable with that, but the consortia that we're seeing have a significant level of participation from foreign sponsors who may have limited Japanese language capability and may not be comfortable with Japanese language documentation. So that's actually a real point that needs to be clarified within the consortia and amongst the lenders at an early stage. So that's it for my portion of this presentation. So thank you very much. I'm sure I saw a few questions sort of flash up, so we'll probably deal with those at the end of the presentations.
Thank you so much, Pierre. And yes, there is one question for you, and we will go on it later. So next, welcome Mr. Masa-san, and to add the finishing touch on the topic of grid connection. And Masa-san is member of the project group in firm's Tokyo office, and he has over 15 years of legal experience in Japan and overseas. Masa-san's practice focuses on matters relating to power, gas, and renewable energy. He regularly assists clients in electricity retail work, electricity regulatory work, offshore wind projects, and other related work. In addition, he provides advices on intellectual property and dispute solutions. So, hi, Masa-san.
Okay. Hello, Sari.
Yes. So, would you mind share your slides with us and begin your presentations?
Sure. Okay. Let me put my slide up.
Sure.
Okay. Hope you can see my slides. Hello, everyone. My name is Masa Tanabe, and I'm counsel in the Tokyo office of Baker McKenzie. We're probably running out of time, so I'll try to go through my slides as quickly as possible. In this final part of the session today, I would like to talk a little bit about the grid connection issues in Japan in relation to offshore wind projects. And there has been several developments recently in this area, so I would like to highlight them in the following slides. But before we do go into the details of those developments, let's remind ourselves of the basics of Japan's grid. So here is a map of Japan, and as you can see, it is a very long, narrow island. And we have 10 regions, and there's a regional grid for each region. And the interconnection between those regional grids is very limited. And as you can see, Japan has 2 frequencies. So on the eastern side, we have 50 Hertz, and on the western side, we have 60 Hertz. There are historical reasons for this. So if anybody is interested in the historical reasons, please do ask those questions later on. But what this means is that the Japanese grid is not really ready to connect all of the volume, all of the renewable energy projects that are being prepared or developed. So the grid needs reinforcement. So we need to keep this in mind as we look through the regulatory aspects. One of the most important regulatory aspects in Japan is that the grid connection process is separate from or independent from the offshore lease auctions that we have been talking about throughout today's session. And actually, as you can see on the left-hand side box there, these various processes are separate in Japan. with the exception of feed-in tariff and offshore lease auction being linked together. But the other processes, grid connection, EIA, and the other construction permits, these will be separate. So the developer needs to go through each process separately and independently. And what that means in terms of offshore wind is that the bidders who will participate in the offshore lease auction might or might not have grid connection rights. And you can participate in the auction whether or not you had grid connection rights or not. But there will be some adjustments later on in the auction, depending on whether you have grid connection or you don't have grid connection. But we'll talk about that mechanism of adjustments later on. So let's look at how bidders can secure grid connection prior to the offshore wind lease auction. So if you want to secure grid connection rights before the auction, basically you have two routes. And one is the single party process and the other is a multiple parties process. If you're the only project in the area that wants to connect to the grid, then you can just go through the single party process. It's pretty easy. It's one-on-one process with the grid operator. But if you're in a region that has multiple projects that want to connect to the grid, then you have to go through this specific process that we'll see in the next slide, and then secure grid connection rights. So it's a lengthy process, and this is something unique to Japan. So let's look at the multiple parties process. Now, up to September 2020, we had a process called, in English, octo process, or in Japanese, 𝗏𝗡 process. It was a lengthy process. This process started in 2015, around 2015. It's a lengthy process. There were many complaints on how lengthy and complicated this process was. So METI was looking to revise this process, and in October 2020, they introduced the new collective review process, or 𝗏𝗪𝗪 process. It's relatively lengthy, but it's supposed to make it more efficient and make the time period shorter than the previous octo process. But most of the offshore wind projects for round 1 and round 2 were secured their grid connection rights through the previous octo process. So let's look briefly at the octo process. There are a number of octo processes throughout the region, throughout the country at the moment. But the largest one is the one in Tohoku North area. So it covers the entire Tohoku North area, as you can see in the map here, and it involves 16 offshore wind projects. So this is how most of the offshore wind projects to date have secured grid connection rights in this Tohoku area. And that includes the promotion zones such as Akita no Shiro, Akita Yuri Honjo North, and Akita Yuri Honjo South. And it also includes the promising zones. There are the next candidates for promotion zones, such as Aomori North, Aomori South, and Akita Happo. So this is how the existing projects have secured grid connection rights before going into the offshore lease auction. But what if you don't have grid connection rights when you participate in the offshore lease auctions? Well, that's okay. There is a mechanism for bidders without grid connection rights in the auction process. So if you don't have grid connection rights, but if you win the offshore lease auction, you will need to purchase the grid connection rights from the grid connection holder. This will be a mandatory transfer from the grid connection holder to the auction winner. And there will be a transfer price that the winner will need to pay to the rights holder. And the auction guidelines will set out the formula for the calculation of the transfer price. It's basically what's written here. It's what you already paid for the construction cost allocation amount, plus some expenses, multiplied by the operating profit margin. So that sounds, that may sound easy, but there are various issues relating to grid connection, and METI does acknowledge these issues for developers. And METI is considering ways to improve this grid connection process that we've been talking about. So here are some of the issues that have been identified by METI. First one, if you're a bidder that don't have grid capacity and you win the auction, like we saw in the last slide, you're basically stuck with a grid capacity that was secured by another developer. So you don't have the flexibility to change the already secured grid capacity. The second point is that if you don't have the flexibility, you'll have the risk of securing too little or too much grid capacity at the outset. The third point is that lease auction, there's risk of multiple developers securing grid connection rights. And the fourth point is that although we do have the mandatory transfer of grid connection rights from the holder to the bid winner, the rules are not actually very clear. It's not, for example, it's not clear what you need to transfer. The grid connection rights, yes, but what about the various rights that are associated with the grid connection rights? It's up to the bidders to negotiate in good faith, but the rules are not very clear. So this needs to be clarified in the future. So METI does acknowledge these issues, and they have been discussing how to improve. And they have some ideas. So these two are some of the ideas that they have been discussing, and this is based on the recent METI committee meeting that was held in February. One idea they have been discussing is the use of non-firm connection. Non-firm connection itself has been introduced in January this year. It allows project holders, project developers to use the grid capacity that is available after the other parties use the grid capacity. So in the you can see the orange portion will be available to non-firm connection projects. So what METI is thinking is maybe project holders who want to increase their grid capacity could use this non-firm connection area, this orange portion, to expand the grid capacity at a later date. So that will give some flexibility to the grid capacity for the project. The second point is the government involvement. So all of these issues go through a separate process and secure the grid connection rights from the grid operator on its own. There's no government involvement. But as you might see in other jurisdictions, it's much more efficient if government comes in and secures the grid capacity for the future bid winner. So METI is considering to implement a mechanism for government to come in and temporarily secure grid capacity just prior to designation of promotion zones. So that will likely really make the grid connection process much more secure and visible to project developers. So METI has these ideas, but it's not clear when they are going to be implemented. So we, the industry, will need to keep a close eye on these developments. We as a law firm will try to keep everybody posted on these newsletters and posting new information on our SNS. So please stay connected and please do watch out for the new developments in the grid connection process. So thank you, and back to you, Starry.
Okay, thank you so much. And so far we have some questions raised in the QA box, and I have just copied like 3 of them in my presentation and share it with you. Okay, so there is one question. We will go through the live Q&A first, and so there is one question for Mr. Nick. And so, what can the Japanese government learn from the airport auctions and to apply to the offshore wind auctions? Do you have any ideas on that?
Thank you. Thank you for a good question. In airport privatization auction, I think it was a very transparent, and we saw many overseas players. For example, Kansai Airport, it's a 𝗏𝗏𝗏 French company, and the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is a joint venture. And also Fukuoka airports, which I served as an evaluator, it was Mitsubishi Corporation and Changi Airport in Singapore. So it's a very good combination. Those type of the overseas players and the Japanese players investing their each experience and knowledges and made a successful cases. So I think, as Ian mentioned, Japanese players and overseas players, joint venture will be a good chance to win offshore wind auction in Japan. So the airport auction tells you the success cases.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick-san. And the next question we received is for Pierre. Mr. Pierre, want to know what is the challenges for logistics of offshore wind turbines? As we know that the major wind turbine suppliers are from Europe, and so what can we build maybe a reliable supply chain and for the local Japanese companies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a little bit of a difficult question to answer from a legal perspective. I mean, I think the expectation is that the difficulties with logistics for offshore wind turbines will largely be the development of the supply chain locally, as well as vessel availability for actual deployment. But in terms of the detailed challenges at a logistics level, I'm afraid I'm probably not going to be able to answer that question. Not sure if Ian, if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay. So
yeah, we welcome factories in Japan.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we can just go through it. And to the third one is also to Mr. Pierre. So there is quite a long one. So from 𝗪𝗧𝗹𝗶𝗴 and want to know that because he knows that I have heard in offshore wind projects in Taiwan that the international financiers pointed out that the ERA regulations in Taiwan doesn't fully cover the Equator's principles. And then the project developer was required further assessments, which will take another like 1 year. So want to know that is it the possibility that the same situation would happen in Japan, or where international financiers have difficult points or requirements from the domestic financiers for the offshore wind projects in Japan?
Okay, that's an interesting question. There's a sort of a couple points in there, so if we can maybe break that down, maybe I'll take the last part of the question first. In terms of whether there are going to be different, or there may be different requirements in terms of environmental restrictions or environmental reporting that may be required by the financiers in Japan or offshore, there may well be a difference. Part of it's also going to depend on who is in your lending syndicate. But for example, the ECAs are going to have somewhat more strict requirements than most commercial lenders anyway. And I think generally speaking, in terms of policy requirements, the environmental policy requirements for banks in Europe tend to be somewhat more strict than in Japan. But at the same time, a lot of Japanese banks, especially the major Japanese banks, are taking on board a lot of the sustainability goals, including things like the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 principles and requiring the inclusion of that kind of compliance in their finance documents. Now, the first part of that question more relates to whether or not the environmental impact assessment regulations would, I guess, fully cover the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 principles. Difficult to assess. They're going to be a little bit different, but I think the environmental impact assessment requirements in Japan are relatively stringent. So there is a possibility, I think, that the requirements or the EIA that get completed in order to satisfy the Japanese regulations might have a few gaps between what's there and what is required by financiers, but I wouldn't expect those gaps to be massive. So I don't think you'd see a similar situation to Taiwan.
Thank you so much. And
yeah, I'd like to add, this is a very important point. And I attended the Danish embassy seminar, and this point was raised, Equator program. And the Danish embassy recommended to use a Danish consultant for environment assessment. So that may be some possibility to use the international consultant to meet the international standard.
Thank you for the further edits. And as you can see, up to now we have other further questions in the QA box, and please look into the QA box. And there is one to Masa-san, and because it is in Japanese, and would you please look into the QA box and answer it live?
Okay. Okay, I have it on my screen. Okay, the question is about the Japanese government securing the grid connection rights on behalf of projects, and when will that likely happen? This is difficult. This is difficult. They are, in discussion in METI committee meetings, and they are, designing this process. Maybe in a few years. Nick, what would you say? A few years?
Yeah, few years, I guess. WPA is asking the METI and MLIT to implement this centralized system as soon as possible. So we hope in a few years' time. Yeah, it's the Dutch model, the Netherlands model. So.
Okay. And another one is also for Masa-san. So what will be the process and be if a developer secure the grid connection, not via a CTO process, but directly with utility, but later does not win the OW lease area tender? And I think that is the case of 𝘄𝗏𝗄𝗏.
Oh, I see. Question is, if you have secured grid connection through the single party process, but you lose in the offshore lease auction, what happens? Okay. That, I guess that would, again, when you do participate in the auction, you have to commit to transferring your grid connection rights to the winner. So, right, even if it's a single party process or the octo process, you will, if you lose the auction, you will need to transfer your grid connection rights to the winner. Nick, again, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, it's a 𝘄𝗏 specific issue. In 𝘄𝗏, they have two grid. So the winner takes a larger grid. But what happens, the smaller grid, 181. Yeah, that's it's a loss of grid, and it's not beneficial for everyone. So the government may start another auction for a smaller grid only, maybe. Otherwise, the grid is unused. So it's a loss of the whole economy. Yeah, but you're right. This is a very interesting question.
And due to the time controlling, we will answer the final questions in the Q&A box. And about the joint ventures for foreign companies like RW Renewables and Restart with Japanese partners, and they sometimes do not disclose how much each party holds the JV. So to win a bid, so would it be necessary to give 51% to the Japanese partner? And what's your assessment on that?
Yeah, there is no restriction of the shareholding ratio. So you can structure 100% or 30%, 51, 49, as you like. But maybe for some local content part, the bigger Japanese part may be advantage, but instead, if you have overseas players with a good track record and would like to stress that part, maybe a larger part of the offshore overseas players ratio may help. So it depends on the proposer, each proposer. Ian, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. That's a really good question because it's come up a lot. Look, I think the key thing is how do you demonstrate that the parties, regardless of their shareholding, are going to be able to contribute to the project. So I think the emphasis is not so much on what's the percentage of shareholding, but it is, what is your contribution? Which team members can you bring from Europe to the project company? How can they contribute their experience and knowledge to develop the project and make it work? So, it's not a focus on it. Do you have 50 or 51%? It's really on, what's your team and your knowledge and your contribution going to look like, and how do you show that in the bid?
Yeah, you're right. If the presentation, actual physical presentation happens, you need to show the best person in your team, and the professors will make a teasing question to you. So you should respond in an actual presentation stage. So it's a tough exercise. So you should employ the best person in your team.
Okay, thank you so much for the detailed explanations to the questions. And for other questions, like we will share our presenters' contact ways and together with our post report by next Monday. And I think that we have finished all the session today. And please here to express my big thank you to all our presenters today. And so, thank you for the previous preparation and for today's webinar. And many thanks for Baker McKenzie's knowledge support us again to make this such a meaningful one. And also a big thank you to our audience to staying with us till now. And this webinar, the slides with the report will be sent to all the audience next Monday. And you can also find our other wind also the series on our Leader Associates website. So at last, thank you for all your coming. And instead of the webinar, and I'd like to remind you that we have also a physical gathering on this year's on June 17th to 18th in Yokohama, and will be a physical and a person-to-person one. So looking forward to meeting you all, and we aim to create more meaningful conferences, accelerating the onshore and offshore wind development in Japan. And hope you all have this new business revive in 2021. And thank you so much for the time and coming here again. Thank you so
very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.